Hi, folks. Welcome to another Monday EDGEy conversation. We're here with the EDGE staff team today, which is always a great way for us to start our week. And we're really excited we get the chance today to talk about safety and change, two pretty big things that come up pretty often for our team. So it's great for us to do some framing about this and think about it more broadly. So really today our conversation is within this context of what does it mean to be safe in the context of how do we do that when things are changing very rapidly. And our sort of thinking or approach today is to really base this conversation or ground it in safety within your communities of faith or within your organization, particularly as folks are navigating really big change as they move through things in this sort of, I'm hesitant to call it post-COVID world, as we're shifting back to being in person, and as we're also thinking kind of broadly about what's going on societally, about what that means for United Churches, what that means for communities of faith. And so how do we manage safety? How do we approach safety in the context of change? So that's the big picture for today. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of things we won't get to around that topic. But to kind of start us off, I'm like always, I'm trying to hope we'll kind of build a container, get a little bit on the same page as we chat. So the first thing is like, what do we mean by safe, which is a huge question. So I will turn it over to Alexandra.
Yeah, and what an important question to ask. It's definitely interesting to think about. So when I think about safety, or what does it mean to feel safe in terms of like being at church or being in a collective space, you can go directly to the physical side of things and being like, what is our distancing policy or our masking policy, like things like that, and how people are kind of approaching how they feel like physically in a place. But where my mind really goes is like, how are we cultivating this like space to feel like the place where we can be as authentic a person as we are, as God made us, and in relationship with God and in community in a way that like we may not feel like comfortable to do so outside of a church building, or outside of those other sorts of relationships that we've cultivated in this like community that we're a part of. So that safety really is around like feeling that ability to be vulnerable, and that ability to express questions and doubts, and know that you're not going to be, kind of looked at funny or pointed at, or, whatever, centered on for having a different opinion or a different way of being, but really like, being in a community of people that allow for those questions and those wonderings to flourish. So that's kind of where I go when I think about safety in church.
Yeah, I think so much of that really resonates with me, particularly as I was getting ready for this conversation today. I think for me, this big piece about like, how do we do shared vulnerability? That's for me a big component of like safe is like part of like being able to be fully vulnerable, and know that there are other people around you who will see that, who will honor that, who will witness that, and will support you when things are really hard. And I think things have been really hard for folks for the last couple of years. And so like having this collective sense of like trust and vulnerability, and a shared desire to do this work together is all part of building safety within our communities or within our organizations.
Yeah, great comments, both of you. The first thing that came to mind for me was safety is probably not what we think it is. And we often put safety in tension with or in relation to change. And the one thing that seems certain to be of existential risk right now is the failure to change. Climate, how we deal with the earth, xenophobia, polarization of wealth, the failure of the social fabric. More and more. So that's kind of the one thing, and that the capacity to change is safety. It's the one thing we know is that status quo doesn't work, but organizationally, that's always countercultural because direction is set by those in power, and those in power are reluctant to change. Right? Like that's just rational. That's not even a judgment on, it's maybe a judgment on hierarchical systems and their limitations, but you know, change feels threatening because it will change, it threatens the power relationships in community. The other thing that really got me was, or that came to mind, is that, and again, not something we normally think about with change, is that safety is a faith claim. We make assessments, but so, you know, this opposite, faith is kind of a, is how we make a claim of safety when all the evidence is to the contrary. Because as a Christian, I would want to say, we're all safe, relax. Meaning we are held in a love that we can hardly, you know, comprehend. And that love transcends life, even life as we know it. So what's the downside? What's the risk? So to a certain extent, safety again becomes a matter of ego. It's around expectations and whether those expectations for a certain, you know, outcome or reality will be met. And that's what I was hearing, you know, in both you, Alexandra, and Zoe's thing about both community and openness. Like safety is in, again, counterintuitive to a modern mindset is vulnerability. We have to be open to each other. We have to be open to, because that's where the abundance is, that's where the safety is. Open to change, open to the reality of faith, and open to the reality of our life experience beyond our fears and ego. Anyway, that kind of ranged from the political to the esoteric, but that's where I started on this.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. I think, yeah, the definition around these words is so interesting. Like, what do we mean by safe? And for me, I think that does revolve around expectation. Like when we feel safe, we know what to expect. And I think we also feel like we're in a position to then influence those expectations even, like, so, you know, and I think of safety equipment, it's like helmets and seat belts and all these things that have been tested, and we know we can sort of rely on them to behave a certain way. We trust what's going to happen. And I think so what does that look like when we invite change into that? Like I think where we feel unsafe is when we really don't, because we don't know what change is going to result in, and we don't know, we're not going to have those safety levers, right? Like, oh, we're going too fast. Like, where's the seatbelt or the brake or the, you know, like all those precautions. And so, but I don't see safety and change as like opposites. You know, safety is like, change for me is the opposite of change, is almost like an inertia, which doesn't, to Rob's point, and was maybe named too, like that it's not, that's not necessarily safe. That's just really not being surprised or something. I don't know. And so I do think that's an interesting, and I also, like, I know different personalities, right? Like I really do well with change. Like I like change, not, you know, I like to choose the change, of course, but but like I like that, you know, like things to be mixed up a bit and stuff. So it's within a reason. So there's an interesting thing there where, like, if it's not changing, it actually can start to feel unsafe. And I'm curious what that means around my expectations, right? I expect that we can reevaluate or adjust things, and if we can't, then that actually doesn't feel safe then.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bronwyn. That really helped me clarify something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is I think sometimes we have this like maybe cultural narrative or cultural myth that safety also means no conflict. So like safety is like, I'm not sure, and maybe one of you will help me, but there's something about like this lack of conflict that we seem to associate with safety. And like, I feel like that's not true. Like, I think safe enough allows us to have conflict that lets us move into new directions or lets us move into change in a way that is about collaboration and building together. And I think that's part of this, like this piece around like, what do we expect safety to look like? Or what is our cultural messaging about what safety really is? And do we all have a shared sense of that? So it was helpful for me to hear your reflections there.
That's so curious. I find this conversation fascinating, as with all of our all of our edgy conversations. But like what I keep going back to in my mind is like the one person who raises their hand in the classroom to ask a question. And then you're like, oh, I was thinking of that, but like, thought that, it was obvious or like maybe it wasn't a worthwhile question. And then they ask it. And then the prof or teacher is like, oh, that was a really interesting question. Let me dive into it. And you're like, like I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that question. And like, but I didn't have like the bravery within this context to kind of like ask it. And so like that just makes me think about like, how are we like cultivating spaces that feel safe, that allow for that bravery, because there are always going to be other nodding heads around the table that are like, oh, I was thinking in that direction too. And if we start to move as like collective fish, I guess, like in a direction, then, or if we have like lots of these spaces where people have that safety to feel like, oh, like, I'm one of many nodding heads. It just happened to be my voice that like spoke out about something or like introduced something or asked a question, then like it really just changes the way in which we can think about like morphing the world that we're in. I think a little bit about advocacy in this sense as well. Like if you're sitting here wondering, how are we, being in a more welcoming and loving church in our community, and then you don't even think necessarily about doing I guess the affirming process, and then somebody says, oh well, why don't we do this affirming process, and then it becomes a priority in the congregation, and then you've done it and you're starting to lean into what this means to be more welcoming in like a new way. And so like it's really just finding, how can we cultivate those spaces so those brave voices who have like the bravery to say something can say something, or to like cultivate a space where any voice can feel brave easier, or without like such a strong sense of vulnerability or risk. And then realize like how many nodding heads we have around. We're like, oh, actually, like it's time for us to do something about this. And like now it's time to lean into this change. And I feel safe about this because I know that there are like 15 other people that also agree with me, or like agree with this sort of like path forward. And the thing that's not safe is not having those questions asked. It's like the assumption that other people have a different opinion or a different view or a different set of questions that prevent us from even asking questions or presenting a view. And if we allow that to be more dominant, then that actually creates an unsafe space, because we're not really allowing the spirit to move. That like, yeah, we're not allowing the spirit to move in those spaces. So.
Yeah, Alexandra, I think you've like really helped me kind of and shift our conversation a little bit in a direction that I thought it might go. Is like, it feels like there's a sense of like safe, and then there's a sense of safe enough to be brave, or safe enough to be bold, or safe enough to like make your voice heard. And so then this was part of my curiosity coming in today, like, when does this first safe kind of start to prevent us from letting the spirit move? Like, what is that particular version of safe where maybe at a surface level almost it feels like safe is happening, but there's actually something underneath it that's not letting the spirit move, that's not letting us engage in mindset shift or in change or in this like school of fish thinking where we're all collectively kind of doing this work together.
It's a really interesting topic. So I think the thing that's becoming clear to me in this conversation is safety looks very different depending on your location. Like I'm thinking of these when you talk about brave space and so on. It depends on if you're gonna, you know, safety for me is like people are sharing what they're thinking, like the variety of viewpoints, and conflict is normative, and you know it's part of how we move into a new future. Easy for me to say as a retiring white guy, and you know, but not always safe to share what you're thinking, right? Like not always safe. And then, so then it got me thinking, well, what is, you know, this business of, you know, change is necessary, almost like risk is necessary to be safe, which now risk and safety sound like opposite things, but, you know, it goes to, well, what is safety about sustaining life? And I'll give you an example, because I think this is where the church is in a way. It's going to be a kind of a harsh, Tom Bandy once wrote a book called The Addicted Church. So I'm going to use an addiction metaphor. Harm reduction is a safe strategy for governments because they measure deaths, and you can keep people alive on naloxone, right? You can keep people alive on a drug that will keep them addicted, but not dead. But what kind of life is that, right? You know, often in addictions, there's conversation about it's the risk of death that actually becomes the transition point to, or, you know, the impetus for change. So is that safe? Is harm reduction safe? And it's kind of like that in the church, like people trying so hard to keep the thing going, feeling like it's keeping it alive, but is it alive? I remember when I was at an event at Queen's University, a church event, and one of the professors had done kind of a cultural thing on zombies, because zombies in popular culture. And in a question, I coined the phrase like zombie church. Like often what we're doing is like zombies. It's moving, trying to move, but it's somehow doesn't look alive. It's pretty scary. And the interesting thing was, like, that was just a thought that came to mind that I probably shouldn't have said out loud, especially on a microphone. But this whole ripple of laughter that went through, you know, the gathering of 300 or 400 students, because they totally resonated with it. So I think this is a really important question, right? The sustaining of life, is that the same as growth, or is, you know, we still think in modern terms that life is static, life is equilibrium. Whereas what you pointed out, Bronwyn, this inertia, like second law of thermodynamics, once we reach equilibrium, it's dead. It's like nothing's moving now. There's no tension. So anyway, paradoxes.
Yeah. And that's also like, I'm also curious about and wondering about like how often we maybe shift into this place of conflating safety and status quo, and what that means in this context of like faith or communities of faith, and how we're like, how that also brings in this sense of like, how are we navigating power and privilege? And so how do we, there's, I think, maybe a temptation to call it safety when it is actually holding on to status quo, which is really about like holding tight to these things around like capitalism, around white supremacy, around getting to be in a position of power and not wanting to let go of that. And so but if it's framed as safety, then it's hard to say that there's something wrong, because we want safety for folks. We should be striving for safety. And so it feels hard to get into this place, Rob, where you're talking about like, how do I say these things with the microphone on so that people can hear them without it feeling like I'm sort of destabilizing their whole world. And so there's a piece there for me that feels quite sticky, particularly in a community context or in an organizational context.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something Rob said, but I think it ties in actually, like where you've gone is taking me full circle back. Where Rob, you were talking about like in if we're faithful or like religious, well, I don't know, faithful, religious, I can't remember the term now. Are we safe? Like, shouldn't we all just feel safe in that? But I do think there's a question of like, does Jesus, I don't know, is Christianity about safety, or is it about actually about like peace, or like being, so either being peaceful or bringing those things, like, is it, you know, I don't know if it is that safe, like it's in that, like, I guess that's the nuances of all these words. And it reminds me of several years ago, I heard a sermon by Tom Long, who talked about, it was quite a witty sermon, actually. I remembered it. He made an illegal left turn and got a huge ticket for it. And so but he felt very justified in that he'd made this turn. And so he did like all of this research, and he showed up at court, like he challenged it, and he showed up and he had all this paperwork. And when he got there, the police officer hadn't shown up. So the judge said, well, we waived the ticket, like you're free from the ticket, and blah, blah, blah. And his reaction was, but I don't want to be free, I want to be right. Like we have this, like, which I just thought was such an interesting, like, thing that I think, you know, I can certainly do this, where it's like, it's not, I get that, I guess that ego gets in there or whatever, right? Like I want to be justified. I want to know that I'm right somehow, or that I've done the right thing, or that I'm, you know, and I think in some of that religious piece, like the safety of it is actually that we're free from some of those things, right? That's the invitation. And that's really hard. And I think that is where like safety can sometimes be about following the rules, or doing the right thing, or having other people agree with that you've done the right thing, even though the invitation to change, or it can actually be really life-giving and freeing and other, yeah. So that's a really interesting, like, okay. Now it's just swirling.
That's so provocative what you just said, Bronwyn. This like bringing it back to Jesus's example, and being like, well, you know, Jesus basically was the most countercultural thing that existed, and was really pushing all of the different norms and all of the different things. But the safety that he experienced was in his relationship with God, and his relationship with faith, and his relationship with the other people that were surrounding him, and kind of supporting and cradling Jesus as he was on this incredibly profound journey that has shaped all our lives. But he didn't sit in safety very often, you know, like, and when he did have moments of like sitting in what we would perceive as like, you know, safety, he took those moments and still kind of like was open to change, and was open to like really pushing some buttons, being like, well, you know, I'm talking with this kind of higher up on the up and up, and so I'm just going to insert this little question here, and like insert these things where he's using some of his perceived power, I guess, to be able to make people think. And so that's not really a safe place, but that's also a brave place, and that bravery was created again by that community that he's a part of, and also by his relationship with God, knowing that, you know, God's guiding what is happening and has his back, and also knowing that he, as a human, as part of God, I guess, had free will in figuring out, well, what are the risks I'm taking, and what are the things that I'm going to be doing, and how am I participating in this whole journey. So just thank you for that. That really has just kind of spurred this whole other direction of thought for me. Thanks, Bronwyn.
I want to start with a correction. When I said naloxone, I was really meaning methadone. I don't want people to stop giving naloxone to somebody who's dying on the street. But kind of methadone as a replacement drug kind of idea for a long-term strategy. But what we're talking about now, I'm starting to think of Claire's leading adaptively criteria around the productive zone of disequilibrium. Like you need risk and unsafety for change to happen, but too much and it's chaotic and not productive. But again, you know, the assessment around where those boundaries are and what is it you think the change that's needed. You know, for those of us who work in change, in fact, we often say things like, you know, raise the risk level, or might intentionally be provocative in a way to kind of raise the perception of risk and unsafety. Like around, we used to do an assessment for congregations that would help them see their financial and future kind of prospects if the status quo remained more clearly. And what that did often was drive them more into trying to hold on to the present because it raised the fear level and it's not a rational choice. So some of this stuff, but I like that idea. I think that's still a kind of a helpful idea around life functions within a zone of viability and beyond it. So, you know, maybe we're not risking the children's lives, but maybe need to risk some reserves in order to change.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm starting to hear now, is I think I had come into this conversation really with this sense almost that like safety was this static thing kind of in the middle and change was happening around safety or to safety. But I don't think safety is static. I think safety is always having these little micro changes or micro shifts within it. And so I'm like, if we can start to be conscious to those, to bring our awareness to those, then it's like, oh, change is happening within safety all of the time. So we're already doing change and we're already doing it in a safe way. So how can we just let it thrive? How can we give it some space to breathe and to expand a little bit? That's been, I'm like, oh, safety isn't static. It is also living and breathing and moving, and we have to be able to hold that energy or follow that energy as it moves also.
So something you might not know about me is I'm a really big Formula One racing fan, so a car racing fan. And one of the things I'm finding is coming to me in this conversation is just this incredible balance that they always have between the racing and the safety. And so like when you talk about those ongoing tweaks, they tweak their equipment and the rules and even how, you know, expectations of the drivers, like constantly. It's like, you know, every season there's definitely new things introduced and rules and stuff. So it does make me, and yet they're like the fastest cars in the world and they drive them at crazy speeds and the accidents can be incredibly serious, right? So it's this, it is finding that balance between the very pushing those limits always actually means you really have to be on top of the safety. And when I think of that in our context, I do wonder what that means for, you know, building those safe spaces. I mean, we've talked about that, and I know one of those conversations was like, can you even build a safe space, or can you really just invite people to really try to hold that space? Because we can't guarantee it's going to, you know, if we're really inviting people to share, sometimes we can't hold it. Yeah, we have to be able to respond actively to it. So it does make me wonder what that looks like in our context. And it does make me think a few years ago, they introduced in F1 a technology called the halo. So they built this whole thing around, basically a cage around the driver. And a lot of the teams were against it because they felt that it was going to interfere with the vision and that would be less safe. And there was a very specific accident just last season that saved a driver's life. And the team lead came out very publicly and said, I was dead set against this. Like, I was very public that I was against this. And thank God I was outvoted. Like, and it just makes me wonder in those moments as we struggle with, the varying opinions and approaches, whenever we try to collaborate and as a church be in community, where are those places where we do need to push, like, this is important to have this be safer, and this is important to like experiment and let it go free a bit. Like that's a tough, none of us can predict the future. So that's a really interesting question, I think.
Yeah, you've got me. This is such a multi-layered and nuanced question. So I've now come to the conclusion, it's kind of prompted by you, Bronwyn, that risk-taking is necessary for safety. Again, it sounds contradictory, right? But like the people that test those safety strategies, test pilots or people that push the boundaries in order to know where the safety zone is, that risk-taking is kind of a service for the common safety. Again, it goes to that dynamic aspect of the idea. It's not one thing and it doesn't stay still, but it has these dynamics.
Yeah, I love this so much, Rob and Bronwyn, because then I think, those pieces that Alexandra and I were talking about at the beginning of our conversation today, trust, vulnerability, authenticity, I'm like, those then, like, maybe the risk-taking part is first. It's like, take the risk and then this community will be here if it goes sideways. And that's okay. We're expecting it. We see that you're going to do the work to push the boundary and find where the limit is. And then as a community, we will do the caretaking piece once we find the limit, or if we pass the limit and things go a bit wonky. So I'm like, yes, surely those things have to exist together and have to exist in really deep relationship to each other. This sense of risk-taking and community trust or organizational faith or care about these two pieces. Okay, one last round for comments if folks have it, and if not, I know we could probably talk forever. But I'll invite if anyone wants to say anything else about this. This has been such a good conversation today. Is, like Rob said, really layered, really exciting to think about how this kind of nuanced sense of safety and risk-taking might go. Alexandra.
Yeah, I think like the last thing that's kind of coming to mind right now is like the way in which our perceptions of safety and risk are change over time, over our lifetime. And like when we have more freedom, I guess, in our mind as to like, how we want to take risks or how we want to feel safe. A lot of people attribute your 20s to like figuring out your life and kind of going off exploring and taking a lot of risk. And then you attribute to other moments in your life, well, no, you should be kind of like, settled for a while and figuring things out. And so I'm intrigued as to how that ends up affecting the way in which we collectively perceive and reach into risk within the context of like safety of our communities. And when we have intergenerational community, it allows for different voices to speak up that are at different places within their risk kind of perception in life. And sometimes when we lose that, we lose a little bit of that dynamism, I guess, in perspective. And so yeah, it's just interesting to think about like the perception of risk along the timeline, as well as the way in which we perceive safety on that timeline too.
I'm thinking about, we sometimes think of safety as the absence of failure, and that the risk, the danger is failure or success. But in our own theory of change, right, that necessary cycle of failure at the bottom of the curve that creates the readiness and the openness to, and the information and the partnerships and all of those pieces that need to come in place for significant and transformative change to actually emerge. And I did want to say, because I do know we're coming to the end of the conversation, I'm feeling this rising gratitude for those who are willing to question the bounds of safety, and what a gift that is to the church right now, like especially those people we work with, that are bound to hear from so many people, to put the F word on their project. Failure. And how necessary it is for us right now for life in the church.
I don't know we could wrap it up any more succinctly than that, Rob. So thank you. What a great conversation today. Like always, you're welcome to tune in on Mondays to hear more about what we are grappling with or how we are trying to follow the Spirit. Alexandra, Rob, Bronwyn, thanks so much for a wonderful conversation today, and we'll see all of you folks next Monday.